I wrote the first book about climate change, a quarter century ago now, a book called The End of Nature. And at the time, we knew that climate change would be a tremendous problem, but we didn't know how fast that problem would manifest. As it's become clear in the intervening 25 years that climate change is biting harder and faster than we had expected, the need to do more than write became crucial. We've started organizing to try and build people power in a way that might match the financial power of the fossil fuel industry. Some years ago, maybe a decade ago, I was in Bangladesh, which is a beautiful country, one of my favorite countries on earth, lush and green, crowded. The population of the U.S. squeezed into an area the size of Wisconsin, but so fertile that it's historically been able to feed itself. I was there reporting because Bangladesh is in trouble as climate change comes. It's obviously a river delta, so low to the Bay of Bengal and in danger from sea level rise, already causing internal migration and displacement. Its great rivers, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, have their source up in the fast melting glaciers of the Himalayas, so in danger there too. But when I was there, they were having an acute climate-caused problem. Their first big outbreak in Dhaka of dengue fever, a mosquito-borne disease that's spreading with great rapidity as the planet warms. Mosquitoes like the warm, wet world that we're building on their behalf. And, lots of people were dying in this outbreak. Now, I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so eventually I got bit by the wrong mosquito and was sick myself, sick as I've ever been. But of course I didn't die because I was strong and healthy going in. A lot of people did die. A lot of people die and sickened all over the world now every year from dengue. And I remember thinking, as I was there in Dhaka watching that epidemic, how unbelievably unfair it was when you try to measure how much carbon each country on Earth emits. The 170 million people or whatever it is in Bangladesh are basically a rounding error. You can hardly get a number compared with my country where we're still responsible for the majority of CO2, or the biggest amount of CO2, biggest fraction in the atmosphere. To me, that's a kind of demonstration of how we think about life on this planet. People in places like Bangladesh are treated as essentially disposable, not worth changing our way of doing business to protect their chance at life. And that's one of the reasons when we organize 350 that we organize in every part of the world. This is a global problem, and it's also a problem on which, at the very least, everyone around the world deserves to be heard, to have their say. So, we have wonderful organizers and wonderful organization in places that are small and politically insignificant, but deeply rocked by climate change. Up in Nepal, on the melting glacier, in the Maldives, a Muslim nation vanishing beneath the Indian Ocean as it rises. Maybe my favorite piece of organizing in recent years was last year in the Pacific, where the 350.org teams on the some of the smallest nations on Earth, these Pacific Island nations, Vanuatu, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, places like that, built indigenous canoes, felled trees and made their traditional canoes, and took them to their neighbor Australia and used them to blockade the largest coal port in the world, in Newcastle, for a while, to try and keep those giant ore ships from getting out with their toxic cargo of basically of carbon that would further sink those islands into the ocean. They've been treated as disposable, but they're not willing to be thought of that way. Their slogan across the Pacific now is, "We're not drowning, we're fighting." 350.org is an interesting operation. It started with myself and 7 college undergraduates 7 years ago. And because we had no money and no history and things, we needed to make use of the then emerging opportunities, I think, that the internet provided. We did our best to take advantage of things like Twitter and Facebook, not to send information back and forth on the web, but to organize things in real life. So we estimate that we've organized about 20,000 demonstrations around the world, pretty much every country on earth. And one of the things that's helped fuel that is the rapid spread of those images from those rallies in every direction. It's helped people understand that there is a large movement that they can be a big part of. The divestment campaign has been the fastest growing such campaign in history as institutions around the world begin to sell their shares in coal and oil and gas companies, to say we don't want to be involved in what's now an immoral and financially unsound plan to continue far into the future producing carbon dioxide. It's been a very beautiful thing to watch as universities from Stanford to Sydney to Scotland to Stockholm have all joined in this fight. Big religious denominations, the World Council of Churches, the United Church of Christ. Maybe most powerfully last fall, the Rockefeller family, big philanthropists, but the first family of fossil fuel, the heirs to the original oil fortune, announced that they were selling their shares in fossil fuel because they thought it was neither moral nor prudent to be invested in them. And they said if John D. Rockefeller were alive today, he wouldn't be prospecting for oil, he'd be rapidly trying to build renewable energy. Climate change is by far the biggest thing that humans have ever done. And as we heat the planet, as we add more energy to this narrow envelope of atmosphere in which we live, the consequences of that enormous, unprecedented change become clear all the time. And human beings have already managed to melt most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic and unground the great ice sheets of the West Antarctic that are melting from beneath. We've taken the world's oceans, and we are, after all, an ocean planet, and made those waters about 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago, already with grave consequence for the life that lives within them. I think if you looked on land, you'd probably say that the greatest consequences so far have been rapid changes in the Earth's hydrology, in the way that water moves around the Earth. Because warm air holds more water vapor than cold, in arid areas we see much more evaporation, we see drought. That water doesn't stay long in the atmosphere. The average residence time for a molecule of water vapor is only about 7 days in the atmosphere before it comes down, and increasingly it comes down in deluge, in downpour, in the kind of flooding rain that does nobody any good and lots of people lots of harm. So those kind of effects, especially on our ability to grow crops, are really important. The massive change that we've seen so far has come with only 1 degree rise in the temperature of the Earth. But scientists say we're on course for a 4 or 5 degree rise this century. And if that happens, then we probably really can't have civilizations of the kind that we're used to having. Agronomists, for instance, at Stanford and the University of Washington, calculated a couple years ago that from this point on, we can expect grain yields around the world to fall roughly 10% for each degree Celsius that we increase the temperature. So if we increase the temperature 3 or 4 degrees, and hence cut the number of calories on the planet by 1/3 or more, Well, everybody can do the math in their own heads. I mean, all the things that we theoretically care about, development and public health and peace and women's rights and things, become impossible under that kind of destabilized scenario. California, for instance, is in the 4th year of tremendous drought tied to climate change. Indeed, the climatologists now think that California may be in for more or less permanent drought. The drought may become a normal condition. So far, well, last year, the research satellites indicated that California lost about 63 trillion gallons of groundwater. And that was enough, that took enough weight off the surface that the Sierra Nevada rose half an inch, the great mountain range. More to the point, it's increasingly difficult to grow food in these places. Increasingly difficult even for the people who live there and harvest the food to find water. They're having to truck it in. Some 5 or 6 years ago, Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy, told the California Chamber of Commerce that the computer models showed that by century's end, most of the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada would be gone. And if that happened, as he put it, you can't really have agriculture the way you do now, and I don't see how your big cities are going to work either. Well, he was right, except that it's happening much more quickly. At the moment, the snowpack in the Sierras is something like 20% of normal. That's a really dangerous place. California has enough money that it may for a while be able to buy its way out of the worst of these problems. Its big cities could probably, in an emergency, desalinate water from the sea or something. But most places don't have that kind of money. Look further down, look further south in a city like Sao Paulo, also grappling with tremendous drought, where they're beginning to have to ration water, where people last week were reported to be drilling through their basements in an effort to find groundwater. This is a city of 20 million people. We haven't anticipated what happens to cities of 20 million people in a destabilized climate, but we're going to find out. Some days I remain hopeful. Look, I'm not hopeful that we're going to stop climate change. That's no longer a possibility. We've got a degree of climate change already. We're going to get another degree. The temperature of the Earth, even if we do everything right, is going to go up close to 2 degrees. I'm somewhat hopeful that we'll be able to stop short of the worst case scenarios, because there's now a big people's movement that's arisen to try and take on the fossil fuel industry. Left to their own devices, it's very clear that they would pump every last barrel of oil and burn every last ton of coal and wreck the planet in order to make themselves a little richer than they already are. But we've begun to see effective opposition arise just in the last few years. It's wonderful to see things like the Keystone XL pipeline begin to come under attack, and with it the tar sands in Canada. Magnificent to see people across the Pacific rising up to demand that Australia, rogue nation that it's become, stop plans for the biggest coal mine on Earth in the Galilee Basin. And good to see Australians maybe beginning to respond and tossing out the government of Queensland. And good to see that kind of effort from every corner. It's a big fight, and the other side, I suppose if you were a gambling person, you'd say the fossil fuel industry would win because they've got so much money. But they don't have that many people. And so the possibility for solar and wind coming to the rescue is real. The cost of solar panels drops every day. And so if we can break the power of the fossil fuel industry, we're finally in a place where we can replace them with clean, benign, beautiful power.